All right, welcome everyone. My name is Juliana Medeiros. I'm a scientist at the Holden Arboretum, and I'm going to be one of your co-hosts tonight. You're going to meet Maya Allen, who's our other co-host, in just a minute. I'm going to give you a few technical notes before we introduce our speaker. You guys could just hear me talking again. That was good. Okay. So first, so that you're aware, we are recording this Zoom meeting. And the meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. That's what you just heard me on YouTube. So I closed the window, hopefully not again. And it's going to be permanently archived on YouTube for public viewing. So you can always go back and watch it again. The audience microphones are going to be muted for the entire talk. And we also recommend that audience members turn off their camera during the talk. We do encourage you to ask questions. And for that, we'll be using the chat feature. Our moderator tonight will be Maya Allen, and she'll be monitoring the chat window for your questions throughout the talk. You can submit your questions anytime in the chat, and then at the end of the talk, Maya will choose some questions from the chat window to ask the speaker. And so it looks like it's about time to get started. Once again, welcome to Holden Forests and Gardens Scientist Lecture Series. Our mission here at Holden Forests and Gardens is to connect people with the wonder, beauty, and value of trees and plants, to inspire action for healthy communities. And we are proud to be partnering today with Black Botanists Week to bring you the third installment of this very exciting year-long series entitled Growing Black Roots, the Black Botanical Legacy. This series is covering a broad range of botanical disciplines and delving into the historical legacy of formally trained and self-taught Black botanists. Through this series, we seek to shine a light on the Black roots within botany, to foster a community of Black botanists and demonstrate the diversity within this community. And we also hope to inspire others who may not consider botany a career choice. Lastly, I want to give a big thank you to the Cleveland Foundation for sponsoring this series. The Cleveland Foundation works to enhance the lives of all residents of Greater Cleveland now and for generations to come. By working together with donors to build community endowment, address needs through grant making, and provide leadership on key community issues. Learn more at theclevelandfoundation.org. And with all of that, I am really excited to turn it over today to my co-host, Miss Maya Allen. She's one of the founding members of Black Botanists Week and also a graduate student at the University of New Mexico, where she's studying the ecology and evolutionary biology of the role of phenotypic plasticity in colonization success. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Allen, who's going to tell you a little bit more about Black Botanists Week and introduce tonight's speaker. Take it away, Maya.
Thank you, Dr. Medeiros, for that introduction. We are very excited about this partnership with Holden. Black Botanist Week was founded just this past summer to promote, encourage, create a safe space for, and to find more Black people and BIPOC who love plants. Our speaker tonight is one of the Black Botanist Week organizers and founders. I'm so proud to introduce Dr. Nokwanda Makunga. Dr. Makunga's research in the field of medicinal plant biology focuses on plants of South Africa using an interdisciplinary approach that combines medicinal chemistry approaches, investigating the genetics and molecular biology of secondary metabolites, with ethnobotanical studies investigating local plant knowledge and practices, with a goal to better understand potential medicinal value of South African native plants. Dr. Makunga's research investigates some well-known horticultural species, such as pomegranate, but is also actively uncovering the wealth of traditional uses for South African plant species. Her work documenting traditional uses combined with laboratory and clinical assessments of the active compounds and their effects has been foundational in bringing African medicinal flora to the forefront of medicinal chemistry. Dr. Makunga was a Fulbright Research Scholar from 2017 to 2018 at the University of Minnesota. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm really excited to be presenting this lecture today, even though it is 2 o'clock in the morning for me. And it is basically entitled Of Plants and People from the Past to the Present. I'll take you through a journey of the world's global biodiversity, and then I'll move on to Africa and ultimately into the area where I actually work, which is in the Cape Floristic region. I'll present some past and present ideas with regards to plants and people, and please feel free to interact with your different social media should you so wish. So before I start, I'd like to dedicate this particular lecture to my mom, who recently passed away. And she is very much part of my botanical legacy, as she had a wonderful love for plants. And I suppose in some ways that was encouraged by my dad, who happened to have been the first Black botanist in South Africa. And now I want to move on to the talk itself. And first up, I just want to remind us that certain parts of the world are blessed with enormous amounts of biodiversity. And that biodiversity is not necessarily equally distributed throughout the whole entire world. South Africa, on the other hand, is really a wonderful place to work as a botanist, because it is home to 3 different biodiversity hotspots. And these would be the Cape Floristic region, the succulent Karoo, and the Maputoland, Ponderland, Albany corridor. And South Africa is pretty well known for some stunning plant species, such as this Protea cineroides or the king protea, which actually happens to be South Africa's national flower. And some of the other species that are found here include plants from the group of the ericas and the restios, and many of these plants are endemic in their character. So if we take a look at the species that are found on the African continent, you'll realize that those plants are highly endemic, and that the African continent actually contributes to 25% of all global higher plant diversity. South Africa has about 10% of that global plant diversity, with 30,000 vascular plant taxa being represented in this particular part of the world. It is as equally speciose as China, Mexico, Colombia, New Guinea, Venezuela, and has more plant species than Brazil and Indonesia. The plants in this area are really unique in their character, and the interaction of plants and people thus creates a very different and unique ethnopharmacology. Now I want to turn to the people of the African continent. South Africa has the Aboriginal people as the Kwekwe, as well as the San, who at some stage actually started to intermingle with the Bantu people who migrated from other parts of Africa. And this was around 3000 BC to AD 500. The Kwekwe people and the San people were the hunter-gatherers of this particular region. And information that is linked to archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, and environment has provided much evidence in terms of the significant migrations and the amalgamation of these cultures linked to the Bantu people and the Khoisan people here in Southern Africa. around the 11th century and towards the 17th century, European settlers were passing through the southern tip of Africa, and ultimately in the 17th century actually settled in this particular region. And together they basically brought the slave trade, bringing in people from around the east. And this created a nation which is now referred to as a rainbow nation, which has much social and cultural diversity. And these interactions of plant diversity and cultural diversity are very interesting, especially for somebody that actually studies medicinal plants. So the plants of Southern Africa are very unique. There are many different plant species that are concentrated in this particular part of the world. In Table Mountain alone, you have about 2,000 species that are actually found there, and many of them are actually endemic in their character. Many scientists have been wondering about how these plants actually came about, and they've been trying to understand the evolutionary relationships that have actually led to the species richness and species radiations in this particular part of the world. And some have proposed that it is the very varied landscapes and unique ecological niches that are actually found in this area that might have led to this. There's also proposals that the different plant pollination syndromes that are part of the system here might have contributed to the species richness. There's also an idea that the plants in this area have interesting nutrient acquisition strategies, such as cluster roots that are associated with the proteus, for example, and that in itself might have actually led to both older and more recent radiations. The landscapes are extremely diverse. We have 2 oceans that create very interesting climatic conditions. And in the Cape Floristic region, this results in a winter rainfall area. And in parts of the succulent Karoo, which are actually semi-arid, you will find a splendor of plants that suddenly bloom once those rains actually come. And these plants have really adapted to all these unique environments in incredible ways. So the diversity of the landscapes, the people, the plants themselves makes this a very wonderful place to actually conduct botany. I want to turn now to the different indigenous knowledge systems that actually occur in South Africa. If you cast an eye towards the eastern part of South Africa, you'll meet a variety of different people, such as the Sangomas, as well as Amagikha. And at the same time, if you move on to the Cape, you will actually meet the bush doctors, or Bosse doctors in Afrikaans. And all of these different people utilize this plant biodiversity for health purposes, as well as other spiritual and religious purposes. In South Africa, we've got 2 different types of medicinal plant trade. One type of trade is actually an informal trade that services about 27 million consumers. And this is associated with collectors who collect plants in the wild, who then bring them towards the cities where these plants are actually sold. At the same time, you have a formalized medicinal plant trade, which utilizes the biodiversity of South Africa as an inspiration to generate a range of phytopharmaceutical products. Some of these products will include species such as rooibos or Aspalathus linearis, Pelargonium sedoides, which has got these beautiful dark maroon colored flowers. And for this particular species, it is the tubers that are extracted, and then those tubers are used to generate an extract, which is then used to produce a product that can be utilized for respiratory infections. In actual fact, this product, umcacoque, is actually available in the United States. So the informal trade is really spurred on by the fact that many South Africans do not necessarily have easy access to primary health care. And so plants are very important for healing, and the traditional healers that are available in the region are servicing many people. About 5,000 different plant species are possibly used in the informal trade of medicinal plants in South Africa. And when you compare these ratios in terms of the availability of traditional healers and availability of medical doctors within the population, you can see that there are actually great disparities. So the plants are very important for people, particularly for primary health care. I want to now go back in time and look at the practices of the Khoi and the San. The traditions of the Khoi and the San in terms of the transmission of Indigenous knowledge is really linked to an oral transmission, where elders would actually relay information about the efficacy of plants to young people through oral communication. In the Cape region, you will meet a Rastafarian bush doctor. The Rastafarian Cape bush doctors are very much interested in connecting with their cultural roots. In actual fact, they claim that they want to reclaim their Indigenous Khoisan identities, and that they denounce westernized ways in order to bring ancient and lost cultures into modern societies. Indigenous knowledge is also an inspiration in South Africa to drive the bioeconomy strategy of the country, which is actually also associated with utilizing biotechnology as a scientific tool in order to build socioeconomic development. However, many of the plants that are here are actually poorly studied in terms of their ecology, their general biochemistry and molecular biology, and much information is still needed. And so this brings me now to talk about one of the species that I actually work on, which is Sciletium. I want to trace the research that's associated with Sciletium back to the days of Simon van der Stel. Simon van der Stel was one of the governors of the Cape, and he undertook a journey all the way through to the Namakwaland, which is a semi-arid area here in South Africa. And in his travels, he documented Sciletium as having medicinal value after having noted that the local communities of the Khoi and the San people were utilizing this particular species for spiritual purposes. He identified this species as one that could have commercial inputs, and interestingly enough, it was in the 1970s that active research was being conducted in terms of the chemistry of this particular genus. This genus contains a set of mesembrine alkaloids, and it is utilized in traditional medicine for neuropsychological and neuropsychiatric related ailments. So recently, there's been much excitement about this particular product because it has central nervous system acting properties. And recent research has shown that the extract of Scaletium does actually affect the central nervous system, and studies have been conducted both in vitro assays as well as utilizing in vivo models. We work on this particular species, but our interests are really at an ecological perspective as well as in terms of the medicinal plant chemistry of this particular product. Scaletium trotosum is the species of the Scaletium genus that has been most studied. These particular plants belong to the family Mesembryanthemiaceae, and that particular family contains about 8 different Scaletium taxa. At the moment, Scaletium trotosum is the one that has been better studied, and the other species also need to have their natural product chemistry actually looked at. Some of the work that we've been doing in my particular environment has been looking at mesembrine chemistry in terms of the development stages of the leaves. We are also interested in developing a range of scientific tools that will enable for the conservation of this particular genus at the same time whilst generating commercial products based on this particular plant. So I want to give an example of some of the work that we've actually been doing in our environment. We are able to generate a range of different cultures. Some of these are actually grown in the glass house, and some of these are actually grown in tissue culture. And this enables us to be able to ask a range of interesting questions with respect to the natural products that are generated by this particular species. It's quite interesting to understand some of the ecology as well, because these plants often like to hide in nature. They like to grow under the canopy of other small shrubs. And when they do this, they may actually generate a set of compounds that are known as betalains. At the same time, Scaletium has a tendency to senesce the outer leaves, and these outer leaves dry up, protecting the inner leaves supposedly from ultraviolet light. So I want to share some of the work that we've been doing and some of the results that we have generated in an attempt to understand the development of the leaves in relationship to the chemistry of the leaves as they develop. It's interesting to realize that these plants will actually start to generate a variety of different compounds as the leaves are actually developing. So the apical meristematic chemistry can be very different from the leaves that are actually starting to senesce. We have been utilizing a range of different strategies that have allowed us to be able to characterize the Scaletium extract. And that strategy generally requires the employment of liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry. So this particular slide looks extremely complicated, and that's because the chemistry and the biosynthesis of mesembrine is extremely complex. There are still many different questions that we really haven't got answers to. And some of these are even associated with the manner in which this plant has been used traditionally. The tradition of generating an extract from this particular species or even consuming this particular plant is often associated with fermentation. So the koi and the san would take the leaves of Scaletium and other plant parts of Scaletium, ground them up, put them in a leather bag, sweat them, and then once the oxalic acetic acid had degenerated, they would then chew on this product, and this would give them a sense of euphoria. There's still some conflict in the primary literature of whether this fermentation process actually increases the levels of mesembrine, or that mesembrine is actually broken down to other products that are part of the mesembrine alkaloid fraction. So there are many interesting questions that we actually need to provide information to. Some of these questions are actually associated with the genetic diversity of the Scaletium genus as a whole, and whether that genetic diversity is also matched by chemical diversity. There are also many different pharmacological questions which still remain unanswered. At the moment, we have some understanding of the fact that these plants do have effects on the central nervous system, but the modes of actions are still pretty much unknown. My second example is a beautiful legume, which is known as Sutherlandia frutensis. And this belongs to the Fabiaceae. In our particular environment, we've been utilizing ecometabolomics, where we study the chemistry of different populations that occur in various environments here in South Africa. We have also developed a range of biotechnological tools that include plant tissue culture propagation, genetic transformation, in order to be able to further understand the specialized metabolites that are generated by Sutherlandia frutensis. This particular species is used for a variety of different ailments. In Afrikaans, it is actually called kankerbos or cancer bush, and this alludes to the fact that in traditional medicine, it is used for the treatment of a variety of different cancers. It has an immunomodulatory effect, as well as having anti-diabetic actions. It is a commercialized species, and products are quite readily available in the phytopharmaceutics markets. So the work that we've been conducting in my particular laboratory has been to try and understand the chemistry of the Sutherlandiosides and the Sutherlandins, which happen to be terpenoids and flavonoids. And this provides us with opportunities to go to different parts of South Africa where we actually collect plants from various environments. I turn your attention now to the plants that are actually found in the Northern Cape, indicated here in red. And these plants are actually growing in an arid environment. Whereas the plants that are indicated in green are actually growing close to the coast. Some of the work that we've been conducting in our environment has basically shown that plants collected from different environments have got variable chemistry, which is also associated with variable pharmacological activity. So in order to be able to aid the development of Sutherlandia as a vibrant crop, this would then require for plants that are collected in places like the Northern Cape to be earmarked for treatment or supportive or adjuvant treatment for cancers, for example. Whereas plants that are collected in the Western Cape next to the coast, actually have much better antioxidant activity. We also use the tissue culture system as a fast way to conduct some studies that are linked to environmental stresses. We actually torture our little plants in the tissue culture bottle. And in this particular case study, we looked at the mineral nutrition of Sutherlandia frutescens, where Sutherlandia frutescens was exposed to high levels of phosphates and high levels of nitrogen, and then also low levels of phosphates and low levels of nitrogen. And the results are actually quite interesting because this mineral nutrition manipulation results in changes that are associated with the primary metabolites or the central metabolites of Sutherlandia. This is of significance because it is thought that these primary metabolites might be very important for the immune supporting actions of the Sutherlandia frutescens extract. This study also brought us to conduct some proteomic analysis where we're trying to understand the impacts of the phosphate and the nitrogen manipulation on the proteins. And it was quite clear that proteins associated with photosynthesis and sugar metabolism, nitrogen assimilation, and a range of stress-related proteins are undergoing variable changes when plants are exposed to various concentrations of phosphate and nitrogen. And this is important because those biochemical processes actually drive metabolism towards the production of the secondary metabolites, which are thought to have anti-cancer activity, such as the Sutherlandiosides and the soya saponins that are manufactured by Sutherlandia. So, as a final set of thoughts, I hope that I have managed to convince you that the plants of South Africa are diverse in their character and that they have been an inspiration for the exploitation of these plants in a diverse range of indigenous knowledge systems. And that currently they still hold potential ethnobotanical leads in terms of new drug discovery. Last but not least, the application of a diverse range of scientific tools is enabling us to be able to mine the botanical gold that is a treasure here in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with a saying from Zulu, indlela ibuzwa kwabaphambili, which translated is, ask the way from those who have gone through it. And I'd like to finish off by saying that indigenous knowledge, which is still held by a local people, is of great value, and I hold it in high reverence. I'd like to thank a range of collaborators that have participated in research activities that have taken place in my laboratory. I'd like to thank postgraduate students that have been involved in various projects. I'm going to mention Dr. Lisa Philander, who initiated the work with the Cape Bush doctors in 2007. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Gary Stafford, who continues to collaborate with me. And some of the graphics that I utilized for this particular presentation were actually created by Gary. And I thank you for your attention. Enkosi, danki, siyabonga.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Makunga. That was an amazing and really stimulating talk. I have so many questions and thoughts, but everybody else does too, actually. So I'm going to have to turn it over to Miss Allen, and she's going to get some of those questions answered.
Awesome. So we have some wonderful questions in the chat as well as the YouTube. So the first question is, do all of the plants or the plant biodiversity hotspots around the world have high levels of medicinal plants?
Yes, some of the biodiversity hotspots that I actually indicated in that very first slide do have high levels of medicinal plants. For example, in places like China, the utilization of traditional medicines is very, very vibrant. In places like India as well, and even I'm going to mention the South Americas, which also have biodiversity hotspots. They also have a unique set of plants which are actually utilized by people and whose culture of use actually comes from old.
Wonderful. And then our next question is, how many plants have been tested for pharmaceutical purposes, and what is the commercial value?
In South Africa, we've got about between 4,000 and 5,000 different plant species that are utilized for medicinal purposes. So it is a really daunting task to try and test each and every one of these species for their pharmacological potential. There's been much research that's been taking place since the 1990s in this particular respect, where various researchers around South Africa have been trying to validate the claims of the local people in terms of the efficacy of different plant species. Sometimes it becomes really difficult because plants may be combined into polyherbal mixtures, which are then utilized. And so that makes the discovery even more difficult. There are currently about 35 plant species from South Africa that are in the commercialized space, but there are many, many more that still remain undiscovered.
Thank you. We have a couple of similar questions. So this one comes from our YouTube audience. Are population level chemical differences persistent in a common garden, or are they entirely induced by the local environmental conditions?
That's a great question, and I'm very happy to answer it. I actually didn't share any of that work that we've been conducting in that particular respect. But I'm very happy that I actually put this particular picture as my final thank you slide, because Misbah Hoffman worked on a species called Dodonea viscosa, which has a pandemic distribution. And she did do a common garden experiment with seed that was actually collected from the wild from 3 different environments. One environment occurring in a mountain area, and one environment occurring in a coastal area, and also here in Stellenbosch, which is where I am actually a resident. And Misbah's results were very interesting because in the common garden experiment, these plants continued to maintain their chemical diversification. They also continued to maintain their morphological and phenological characteristics, as well as they expressed different physiological expressions or capacities with regards to photosynthesis. And the medicinal compounds also remained different. And the study that Misbah did also included a microsatellite analysis where she looked at several different microsatellite markers to try and understand the population structure. And that was very interesting because the genetic diversity structure revealed two different types, a coastal type and a mountain type. And these coastal populations, which included the De Hoek population and the Stellenbosch population, were actually similar in chemistry, and they were much more close in terms of their genetic population structure, as opposed to the plants that were actually growing in the mountain areas. So it seems as if the plants are able to remember where they actually came from, and they are able to maintain their genetic and metabolite differences, even if they're growing in similar environments.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So the next question is, what is the connection between your nitrogen treatments and natural symbiotic nitrogen fixation in Southernlandia?
So Southernlandia is a legume, and it does have the capacity to form mycorrhizal associations, and it obviously does this in a natural environment. In a tissue culture environment, these plants are able to root without any assistance, but that environment is obviously aseptic, and so they don't necessarily have the mycorrhizal associations. So we have been utilizing concentrations that are somehow linked to the media that these plants would grow on in a tissue culture system. And the values that we are using are not, when we actually treat with high levels of nitrogen, are not necessarily reflective of what is actually happening in Cape soils, because Cape soils are actually nutrient poor. But we also do treatments where we reduce the levels of nitrogens and phosphates, and even sometimes exclude the nitrogen and phosphates to have a better understanding of whether our treatments could actually translate to a real life situation in the wild.
This comes from our YouTube audience. Does traditional preparation of the same species differ when the underlying medicinal agents, terpenes, etc., of the local subspecies differ?
Yes, medicinal preparations can be different. Often the way in which most of these plants is taken or are taken is through an aqueous extract, but local communities also utilize other kinds of solvents. For example, they can use alcoholic preparations, and they can also take the plants and infuse them in different kinds of fats, and those different preparations will then extract different types of metabolites.
And what is your advice for students interested in the intersection of scientific research and traditional knowledge?
I would say go for it. It's a very, very interesting space. I'm trained as a natural scientist, and because I work with medicinal plants, I have had to learn many different lessons that are actually associated with doing work that has an anthropological angle. I've had to learn about how to be able to communicate with local communities and be able to appreciate their information and not necessarily take it for granted or even undermine that information. So I think it's a very complex environment and space to work within, and one has to conduct research with dignity, and one has to conduct research with a high reverence of the fact that people actually do hold deep and elevated knowledge, which might not necessarily translate to your own personal world view. And so those different lessons are very important. And I think that would be the advice to young researchers, is that you need to remain open-minded, because often people will give you messages about the plants that they work with that initially do not necessarily seem to make scientific sense. But when you actually start to interrogate this information, you actually realize that it is very, very deep.
Thank you so much. This comes from our YouTube audience. Are the Indigenous doctors interested in working with you?
Yes, they really, really are. And often people are extremely excited to share their information because they regard it as community information, and they visualize their roles in society as having a very important role, because they're working with knowledge that has had the test of time, and they don't necessarily want to hold that information to themselves because it actually came from somewhere else. It was actually given to them and passed on to them from somewhere else. And so they are often willing to interact with the researchers, and they are often interested in understanding whether the plants that they are working with do actually hold biological activity, and they are interested in having the scientific backing that actually backs the traditional information.
I'm going to ask a few questions from people who haven't had the opportunity to have their questions answered, and then we'll circle back to the people who are asking additional questions. So there are some thank yous for your wonderful talk. And can you talk a bit about the biology of pomegranates and their ethnobotanic value in South Africa?
So pomegranates do not necessarily originate from South Africa. I think I need to highlight that particular point. But pomegranates are actually grown in South Africa, and pomegranate cultivation is a very important economic venture that actually takes place here. So it's a growing industry, and there are different cultivars that are specialized to be able to grow in this particular South African environment, or different South African environments. And some of the work that we've done in my particular environment has been linked to post-harvest physiology with Professor Opara and Professor Fawole, who are at Stellenbosch University and at the University of Johannesburg, respectively. And we have been focusing on the pomegranate peel because the pomegranate is mainly utilized for its juice, but then the peel actually goes to waste. And if you utilize that peel and you generate an alcoholic extract. That alcoholic extract has got antibacterial activity. And we have a study at the moment that's actually ongoing, trying to understand different ways of actually preserving the natural products that are in this pomegranate peel, because it would really be wonderful to move the waste into something that is of economic value.
You have some more compliments in the chat, and then also someone wants to know, is there a way to support your work?
Oh yes, we're always needing money. So financially, of course, it's always wonderful to get some economic resources. There are several different projects that are being conducted in my laboratory. One that's actually linked to the Botany plant that I spoke about, that has variable chemotypes. And that particular project is in dire need of a significant financial injection, because we have all the different expertise in terms of that particular project. But then also another way in which to support my work is to be able to interact with other scientists and collaborate with scientists that might have different expertise to the ones that are available in my particular environment. So there are many different streams, I feel, in order to be able to support some of the work that we're actually doing here.
Wonderful. And I also want to highlight that Dr. Makunga's email address is here on the screen, so please take that down, and her social medias if you'd like to continue to support her work. So this question comes from YouTube. Do you have any concerns about how some endemic plants with high medicinal values are being exploited by people in some ways? And then they give an example to clarify. So for example, some endemic plant species with medicinal value in China are not being able to be grown in greenhouses yet. So this leads to plant poaching or destroying the habitat for other species.
Yes, we do have some issues with this in South Africa, where large quantities of material is collected in the wild, and especially plants that are extracted for their underground parts. Those harvesting practices are obviously not sustainable on a long-term basis. And the one species that I actually had indicated on my slides, which is wild ginger, is almost near extinction. And it is harvested pretty heavily in areas where it grows. And that harvesting is even moving to other parts of Southern Africa, such as Mozambique. It is also not an easy species to necessarily cultivate on a large scale in order to be able to support both the informal trade and the formalized trades. So this can be a huge problem, but at the same time, species extinctions in South Africa are mainly driven by agricultural expansion. They are driven by urban sprawl and urban developments. And the other top driver of species extinction in South Africa is actually associated with the establishment and the expansion of invasive species. So those are the three main culprits, even though wild harvesting of materials can potentially also lead to a biodiversity risk.
Okay, and then let's see here. Let me just look at the chat. Okay, so this question Would you be willing to comment on social justice issues such as profit sharing with Indigenous people?
Mhm. Yes, I'm definitely able to comment on this. South Africa has a well-established Biodiversity Act, which requires for any bioprospecting activities that lead to commercialized products to lead to the beneficiation with the local people. And in that particular act indicates that benefit sharing should take place with those persons that happen to be the original Indigenous knowledge holders. And so it's very important in order to be able to adhere to those particular laws. So even at the very start of a research project, one has to actually declare it to the Department of Environmental Affairs and declare that in terms of plants that you're working on, be able to identify the Indigenous knowledge holder that might be benefiting. And so that's a very, very important act. It is linked to the Convention of Biodiversity and also to the Nagoya Protocol that also protects different genetic resources. And some of the projects that I actually indicated here have the Cape Bush doctors as the benefactors in the case of commercialization.
Wow, what a lot of great questions. I am going to have to sadly put a stop to all this fun we are having, because I think Dr. Makunga must be tired by now, because it is now 3 a.m. where you are, is it not? I just want to wrap up by giving you a big thank you. It was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you to everyone who came. This video is going to be archived on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it as many times as you want. And please share it with your friends and your colleagues. Also, there's educational materials to go along with this lecture, and they're on our webpage, the Holden Forest and Gardens webpage. And you can find the link on the YouTube channel too. A note for the non-teachers in the audience, you should definitely check out the materials because they contain links to a bunch of videos and articles, digital photos. It's really a lot of cool stuff. You don't want to miss it. And so we will put the link in the chat. And then last but not least, before you go, I just want to remind you to sign up for the next talk coming up on January 13th. We've got the link up live on our page. We'll be hosting Tatiana Soto, a graduate student at Purdue University, and she's going to tell us about toxic soils and special plants, serpentine endemism in California. You don't want to miss that one, so don't forget to register. Thank you again to Dr. Makunga. It has been a great pleasure. And thanks everybody for coming. Have a great night.
Thanks to you, Juliana. I hope that was